Okay, let me start by saying, just in terms of house rules, I think what we'll do is that Dumi will read from the book, right? Just an extract from the book. I don't know if people have their copies here. It's fine. So the conversation is meant to be about the preface of the book. That's the preface. When I first heard that we were just going to be talking about the preface, I was like, hey, I was trying to ask. Because I thought the preface was just short and, you know, we could just talk about the book. But when I had to think from the perspective of the person who was not going to be engaging to me, and start formulating questions around the short preface, I slept late last night, and also had to wake up like early in the morning, because now all of a sudden the small preface had all the richness that I had initially overlooked, or, you know, typical of, you know, how people think about prefaces. It's just kind of direction into what the book is about, but not really the essence. But I think I'm glad that this conversation is precisely about the preface, because I would imagine there's so much to talk about between the two of us regarding it. So what we'll do now is to allow women to read something from the preface, and then from there, after, we'll have an exchange, more fluid exchange, and then after that, we'll probably speak for like 40 minutes? However long you want. Okay, we'll see how it goes. But I'm not going to exhaust the conversation myself. I'm not going to speak for long. And then we'll open it up, because I'm sure everyone will also want to chip in and have a few things to say.
Sure. Yeah, first I have to say thank you to September and the team here, and to Ati for saying yes to sort of that invitation as well. But again, this is an ongoing conversation, you know, that I've been having with Georgia. But I think it's great that we find time to sort of like think these thoughts out loud. And I mean with a lot of other people as well. So what I'll just sort of like read. The preface is 3-4 pages, but I think in these 3-4 pages, it sort of like encapsulate all the moves I'm trying to make in the individual essays themselves. Because from the individual essays themselves, I think I'm trying to pull these theoretical strands to be able to state a particular failure of things. So I think what I'll do, I'll just read a bit, and how I'm going to read is that I might not explain like most of the technical terms, but I hope that people will take them into account, and we can speak about them in the Q&A. So I'll just read without interrupting myself. Trying to. So, I mean, first let me say I hate, or rather, am not able to speak or give an overview of what these essays are doing. And I think this first opening with an incapacity or not being able to give an overview of the essays like prefaces sort of like normally do. Although I point to the structures of the essay, but I don't point to what the essays themselves are doing, right? So I'm saying this inability is again what Wilson speaks about as outside of an interlocutory light. So I'm gonna, as I said, I'm not gonna interrupt myself. So I'm gonna keep going, and I hope that these big suggestions in the end we can speak about them to what do they actually mean. So he speaks about this notion of outside of an interlocutory life, right, which is outside of relation, right. So the distinction between capacity and incapacity presupposes the notion of being able to articulate something. And again, so I'll carry on, but we'll come back to these points.
Yeah, I mean, you also pointed out my questions now. So just read.
Yeah, okay. But maybe also speak more about this impossibility of providing an overview. And this again would be sort of like the notion of imparting the slave into a narrative. So I'm trying to think about this idea of being able to speak about something as the ability to construct narrative and a coherent narrative that starts with a particular point and then ends with a particular point with no interruption. But maybe we speak a bit more about the impossibility of providing an overview, which perhaps can be a beautiful way to show what these essays are attempting to do. And this attempting to do is to withhold, right? To withhold by not being able to say or to explain. And I think this idea again of withholding comes by way of an incapacity to articulate. So Dasein speaks about the notion of being able to grasp an idea. So in the philosophical sort of like tradition, there's the notion of thought being able to grasp an idea, and this idea, after it being grasped, then can be relayed into the empirical, into the real world. But this is a belated happening. The first move is to be able to grasp that which ontology sort of like.
Okay, let's do this. Read the section that you want to read. Read the section that you want to read, so that you, after you read that,
we can get to this
we'll
point.
get to you explaining some of these things that you want to explain.
Okay, no shame.
Right?
Okay. Well, let carry on.
So maybe let's say start from the beginning, and then read the part that you want to read, and then move on with the conversation.
Okay. I'll start from here. But maybe let me speak about the impossibility of providing an overview, which perhaps can be a beautiful way to show you what these essays are attempting to do, which is to withhold writing which is to withhold by not being able to say or to explain. These essays put together as the aesthetic writing with and from the Black Sonic are writing about the impossibility of black performance, which is again can be thought as something that is outside relation. Or things that are borrowed. This is in part a response to the short-sighted, and the de-aesthetic is with a slash through the aesthetic, right? So it has the aesthetic is scratched out. This is in part a response to the short-sightedness of the feminist de-aesthetic without the slash through the aesthetic. A response to writers such as Sylvia Bovenchen and Beth Wellmuller and Hilary Davis would advocate for, which is essentially the critique of the Anglocentric premise that undergoes the aesthetic. The identification with the gender and identity politics, and these gender and identity politics sort of like gesturing towards what psychoanalysis calls the pre-conscious sort of like interest that allow for identity, what one would like to identify themselves with, right? So their identification with gender and identity politics, attempting to deconstruct, attempting to the turn of deconstructionists, or attempting the deconstructionist turn to recuperate and save the female beyond the patriarchal gaze, but also still within the coordinates of redemption and humanism, right? So, okay, I'll just put it. Yet, the racialized schema Yet the unracialized schema that allows for the gender specificity completely collapses when faced with the black body, which locates itself somewhat outside the coordinates of the human. This dislocation from the coordinates of the human, I argue, makes it impossible to account for the performative moment. Whether it be through language or whether it be through a musical or artistic sort of like iteration of performance, it is pointing to the impossibility as the impasse of performance to grasp or translate black performances essential and essence of existence, or also fail to supplement black trauma and black joy. And I'm also trying to think the notion of black trauma, a dead body, and black joy, the burning of a police station, or the killing of sort of like the alternative forces. So I'm trying to say that black art itself has an inability to sort of like articulate these coordinates of black trauma and black joy. So blackness pushes the limits of performance until it shatters. And I'm thinking that again by way of Julian Mayfield. You touch my black state, I'll touch yours. And there's a way that I think that the Q&A you can speak with for. So I view black artistic performance in the purview of the black performative, which can be seen in the general field of the assumptive logic of agency. Whether through psychoanalysis, Marxism, feminism, or sort of like these emancipatory sort of like gesturing towards theories. Performance or art attempts to hold or grasp and or transcend and sublimate the coordinates of black joy and black trauma, which is anticipated by the epistemic moment that is presupposed by the philosophical move that Kant and all these. But blackness fails this expected performance, because performance per se needs a ground available for the concept to hold. It needs this ontological ground for the concept to hold. Which is the very thing that is unavailable in the black abyss. So I'm also trying to think about this notion of an unavailability that is presented by way of blackness as an impossible, that is preconditioned by the incapacity. So because art is incapable of holding black joy and black trauma, when it is presented, the articulation of those moments are unavailable, right? So I'm trying to think about this moment of this idea that ontology can't reach the moment of black trauma and black joy, and by the fact that it can't reach this, in its performance and in its relay into the empirical world, it's always unavailable, or sort of like held back. I argue that blackness avails no ontological ground, operates outside the range of ontological grasp. That presupposes a transcendental moment into the empirical. This point of collapse is the anticipated moment, or the destruction of art in the hands of the theory. This collapse is conditioned by unimaginable brutality on the conceptual pillars, which positions the black subjectivity within the construct of the world. And I'm thinking about the world in a conceptual framework, and blackness as a particular position that is occupied within the world, right? So it's an ontological positioning. I'm thinking about it as an ontological position rather than an identity, an identity politics of sorts, but as a mode of capacity, as a mode of being in the world, in the way of we think about it in that. Black performances and reachability shatters the anticipated moment of agency. Performance is unable to grasp the phenomenon non-being, that which cannot be or be. Art then is the violent paradox of the failure to transcend when thinking about the black or black artistic performances. And thinking about this idea of art being this notion of a critical distance, or the idea of being able to transcend the moment of art itself. So I'm proposing that there's a failure of this moment of transcendence out of this, by way of these emancipatory tools which come by way of art and moments. To digress for a moment, let me bring Heidegger in here to dwell on his formulation of language as the house of being, or rather as the wall of being. And rather let me also look about this formulation of Dasein as a form of being in the world, which refers to the immediate experience of a singular being. So, in a sense, I'm taking the Heideggerian controversy, the seed for positioning blackness as homelessness, outside language, right? Outside the coordinates of language. And I'm also trying to think about the idea of art itself being presupposed as another way of a language, or of a practice of being able to relay a message. So subsequently, blackness as an impossibility to articulate this positionality of a paradigm of silence and illegibility. It is through the capacity to grasp language as a tool or as a hammer by way of Dasein, that Dasein claims its existence in the world. And then Lacan speaks about the notion of one comes into the world by way of relation. That only by being able to relate to other beings or other contemporaries is one able to function as a full human, right? So there's a real reliance on the notion of relationality in all performative gestures that blackness articulates, or that being articulated, that get reciprocated, but which blackness makes unavailable. So black flesh's status of non-being introduces an impasse into the language, what language makes possible to articulate. We see at once that when black flesh attempts performance, a failure to transcend the narrative closure of homelessness arises in that instance. We see performance failing to reach the depths of the black place. By saying this alludes to the paradox of a terror of black performances enjoyment as it is precondition of the gratuitous violence or the inability to be accounted for. These are monstrous turns in which a failure to grasp black positionality leads to a breakdown of performance. In the hands of the black flesh, performance, thinking by way of his spirits, fails to transcend the moment and falls into the abyss, and also thinking by way of Brent Edwards, thinking about the scat, and scat is a formulation that jazz musicians have used by way of improvising. So he opens his book, Epistrophes, saying the scat begins with a fall. And trying to think about this notion of the fall outside of race, the fall outside of subjectivity, the fall outside of humanity, as this moment that preconditions one to improvise a language of sorts, because one is then outside the enclosure of language itself, or the enclosure of being able to relay oneself relationally to other beings. So this collection of essays offers an unthinking of both performance and the sonic, as neither a reduction nor an abstraction of black life. The aesthetic under erasure functions as a belated refusal of that recoupment that the feminist aesthetics attempts in trying to retain the human subjectivity. In its mode of the dialectic encounter, that this humanism proposes. And dialectic encounter again, hinging on this idea of recognition, that by this performance, one is recognized and one is reciprocated. But again, speaking about this black performance that is outside this encounter of the dialectic. First, thinking through aesthetic under Eredet is an attempt to refuse the binary logic that finds itself in the humanistic discourse of being and beauty. To think of this incapacity of such a category to be held. And I'm thinking again, this ability of Dasein to grasp or to hold or this notion of being the ability to have held an idea. What I mean by the category that I've never held is that which cannot hold. Consequently, is a category that by way of incapacity doesn't offer itself as unavailable. To take it further, that is to say that incapacity of the nouns beings claimed to performance or creating a positionality inside the coordinates of being marks a vagrancy. This homelessness of wandering or dislocating from its being's capacity or being's proper articulation, proper subjectivity, proper conduct, the appropriate things to say, the inappropriate things to say. This notion of homelessness, of wandering, of dislocating from being's capacity for speech and language shatters the idea, is shattered by the idea of an enclosure within natality. Again, we're thinking again of this notion of sort of like natal alienation, social death, by way of non-relation, of living non-relationally. If it is a living, right? So the black performative becomes an incapacity for location. And I'm thinking black again transnationally because once you speak about black, you're thinking about blacks from everywhere in the world, right? You're not thinking about South African blacks, and I suppose we want to call ourselves other things. These are other frameworks, you know, that open up and so the black performative, the black performative becomes an incapacity for location, consequently a precondition for anti-speech. And this is what Wilkerson poses in Red, White, and Black, that there's this idea of sort of like the pre-conscious interest that of what we want to call ourselves, or of the dreams, are shattered by the unconscious identifications of the world. That identity is thrust on you before you can even open your mouth. So there's a way that whatever you want to call yourself is unavailable for a performance relationally to the world. So I'm gonna read this one page, and then I think it will be enough for us. So the black performative becomes an incapacity for location and consequently its precondition on empty speech, right? Speech that identifies itself in the pre-conscious instead of the unconscious, which in the inverse fails the liberated position, which is full speech, which is only accommodated in the human positionality. So it tells of the impossibility of the black non-being's capacity for language and performance. This mode of non-being, thinking by way of a non, means not having a language. And I'm trying to think about this notion again of grammar, the grammar of suffering. So by way of Afro-pessimism. So the idea of the grammar of suffering, by way again extending to Fanon, means not having a language, and fundamentally one is precisely dislocated from performance. By the mere fact of the unavailability of a language to articulate this natal alienation that black performance is always attempting to be. So thinking about writing like a Eredet coupled with the double-bind refusal, which is the belated refusal of a deconstructionist move, of ensuring no return has burdened performance when thinking the black in all mediums, particularly when thinking about it in sonic, in this instance. I do, however, see the sonic as a gateway to touch, which again might lead to thinking about it as pieces, but which again becomes an impasse for language and the demands to be felt in the flesh. He who feels it knows it, by way of Bob Marley. I'm just going to round it off now. In pointing to the ruse or the failure to relate black suffering or black joy, no, I think this is important. I want to layer a general framework of how one can see or read these essays. The notion of the black performative, which is a theorization combined with an approach from Said Hartman's State of Suffrage in Scenes of Subjection, where she says black suffering requires that a white body be positioned in the place of the black body in order to make suffering visible and intelligible. So I'm proposing that I'm proposing that by using pre-conscious tools or sort of like art and language, one is sort of like imploding the slave into a narrative and using architectures or tools of the world, which is like Hartman says, that putting a white body as a prosthesis. So art becomes the prosthesis to be able to relate to that pain, but yet again, art itself has an incapacity to hold the pain So I mean, we then face the conundrum of the failure of liberation and the failure of what the Black Sonic says it's doing. It failed on its promise. It withholds on all these promises, and I think there's a way for us to sit with this failure and see what that does, as opposed to jettison to use it for moments of optimism, because like Afro-pessimism is willing to say that literal examples sort of take this. So this is a question about the conceptual, the ontological, as opposed to literal, because we can say that there's been struggle songs, but we're trying to say that there's a conceptual framework that these struggle songs themselves have failed to articulate what they were saying.
Okay, let's hold it.
Yeah.
Let's hold it there. I want to do something different. I noticed that in your reading of your piece now has takes a very, very interesting form, in the sense that you read, you stop, you interject, or you read, but as you read, you edit.
To interject as I read.
No, what you read a sentence, and the way you read the sentence, you reformulate the sentence.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if people see that. So you reformulate the sentence.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of a kind of like a rewriting of the book as you go along, which I find quite interesting in this moment, because it helps elucidate some of the things that you are attempting to say in the book. But before we get to these things that are very complicated, and I think need us to step back a little bit, and think maybe from a more naive perspective. You are a jazz musician in South Africa, post-1994, where it's very typical for artists, visual artists, and many other people who practice art different to write reflectively about other artists. Of course, I'm not saying that there are no jazz musicians or visual artists who write about art, but I'm also intrigued by the fact that you writing about art as a jazz musician comes out of a context where this isn't a normal thing. I'm trained as a fine artist, but in order for me to do writing, I just couldn't juggle it. I had to drop one and focus on this one. It's the same as someone like Tim Ngozi or Proso Bob and many other people who were trained as this, and then they drop this, and then they do the other thing. So I'm commending you for being able to be a musician and a writer. But I'm also interested in the fact that as a person who's now produced a book, you write this book from a very maligned, very disadvantaged, very unwanted position, stigmatized position. This is in spite of the fact that there is a turn towards black nationalist discourse. Fallism was also a term appropriated by the right wing in South Africa. Decolonization was also a term appropriated. But nevertheless, there is an insistence from the black right movement that insists on writing against the grain. So these are all, from my perspective, things that I think I like. But I want us to go back a little bit to just ask a very basic naive question. Why did you write this book? And not only that, how has it been as a person who, I would imagine when you play your music, people pay attention, some people don't pay attention. But then you come with a book like this. How did you move from, how did the book come about? Just a very practical explanation of how you came to write the book.
How the book came about, we were on the road, we were on the tour. There was a moment where we were quite busy, so we were touring. So these were essays and reflections on the road. And these were essays and reflections, like there were moments where you find yourself in the most strange places in the world. The 1%, because I mean jazz music is that cognitive dissonance, right? Like you would play for the rich of the rich, and then go home into your shack or into your small room in Jan. So for me, it comes from, and I mean this again is that the moment of failure. It's just like it comes from actually asking about just about really and I know it from experiences with my elders, my masters, who have suffered by way of art, who are still suffering by way of art. But there's this hold on to the emancipatory potential of the tool, right? So, and then Afro-pessimism comes in, right? But also, so many other writings, come and gesture towards this, that maybe this is inessential and it's not as essential as we thought it was for to change your life and to change the life of the people that you love. So and the naivete that one goes into the art as a communal activity is that one changes the environment, they change themselves. But there's a constant failure, and the inverse is happening. People are actually dying from taking out this shit, right? so this
taking out what?
The cultural term of I'm going to be a jazz musician,
right?
You know, and be like, I'm going to be a committed jazz musician. So it means that you have to put in the practice hours, you have to put in all the shit that is taken for granted as a tech, like, you know, and then you still have to have a functional life, you still have to have a family, and all these structures that then facilitate for one to be a relational being in the world. But what we've seen by most practitioners, and in the jazz fraternity, but in the arts in a whole, is that like people's families fall apart because of this thing, right? Like not because of anything else, but because of the commitment to the art. You know? So it's just, you know.
So you chose to write the book based on what? What is the impulse? What is the push that instead of saying maybe I will not write a book, I'll go and do it or something. Why did you choose this particular form of representation?
No, I mean, again, being on the road and reflecting on those moments. But in the end, you actually end up seeing that, you know, I mean, these are making sort of like a streamline of thoughts. And of course, engaging with friends and you know, like, you know, I also like know people beyond the musicians, right? So also just engaging with friends who are interested in literature, who are interested in other things, who are looking elsewhere for black knowledge, black freedom, you know. I also then, you know, I mean, then I think it's a way of my performative nature, again, and performing my failed attempt on the drum, you know, on the book that you know what, like, we thought that we were doing this, but actually, shit, we have to pay rent, you know?
And I'm saying this because, you know, I mean, as you say, the failure that black artists experience, it's not a question of when black people fail, black people are considered as people who are bound to fail because they lack a particular kind of attitude and so on and so forth. But you then choose to write a book that speaks from a position that, or an analytical framework that is discredited. I'm thinking, for example, I was reading Louis Gordon this week. For some reason, I had to think about preparing for this conversation. So I'm just going back to things that people have been saying about Afro-pessimism. So if there are people who don't know what Afro-pessimism is, it's an analytic, you know, that is in America in the early 2000s. Basically people who are critical of the kind of ideological solutions that have been provided by either the left wing, the liberals, and how these solutions, ideological solutions, are then projected out as things that would redeem or solve problems, paradigmatic problems, which is structural problems. Feminists say women must take control, rights, and so on. Marxists say the reason why we're failing is because of class, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on. And other people, like Tuve, say that if we return to a better form of humanism, liberalize the world, democracy, all of these solutions that are given by the world. So Afro-pessimism criticizes these solutions and say, but in the face of black suffering, none of these options that are given to us solve the problems. Because our problems are not problems that are conceptual. We are not excluded out of the world because someone conceived a problem in a particular way. Or things that black people are bad because something ends, this and this and this happened. The primary impetus of the world emerges from the fact that black people are available to kill. That is the reason why conceptually based solutions based on the instruments of the world cannot address the experiences. I don't know if I'm making sense. Cannot address the problems of black suffering. So Afro-pessimism in my text is. And throughout the world, people have been criticizing Afro-pessimism, saying that, you know, black people should not be following this kind of formulation because it says that, you know, one of the principles of Afro-pessimism is that black people are slaves. That you cannot disintegrate blackness from slavery. So I'm thinking, Tumi gets onto this analytic at a time when this analytic is almost very dangerous. I mean, for someone who's thinking, fuck, I'm losing bread. You sort of say, I'm losing bread, there's no money, musicians are dying, but yet, the option that you choose is an option of getting into the far end.
But I was losing bread anyway, and this is the other thing.
Right.
Right. And this is the other thing that, but back to that thing that it's not contingent on what you do.
Right.
Right. It's not because you one day spoke out or you like. I mean, like I know some pretty good black folk, like good Negro, like. I do, but still they still fall into the fire, and then you still and this is when you ask yourself, like, fuck, here I am, and by the way, the analytic, you know, I was doing a master's, you know, there I am, I'm doing a PhD, and fuck, like, I'm still suffering, and I was told that, bro, if you get your education in order, that you want to be cool, but then again, these solutions that have been provided. Right. They constantly say it was the art first, right? And then when they just like, but you know when the art is not working, and just like, yeah, but it's like, yeah, so go back to school, bro. Okay, fine, you go back to school. And you know what I mean? So it's again like that moment of the question more than the answer. Yeah, right. Just like, what the fuck, you know? And that question, I think it's you know, and it's this book that says, I mean, like, all these things have failed, right? And not even so let me sit with that.
Right.
For a second. Yeah. Let me put it out there so that when I read I can just sit with it for a bit, right? I don't know what that's going to do.
Right. Talking about doing, I mean, and sitting with failure. You open the paragraph, the first line of this conversation, of the preface, like by saying something that I thought was really quite interesting in relation to how you then proceed, or rather, the premise of the critique. You say, first, let me say, and you read this and you try to kind of say a few things about this. First, let me say, I hate, or rather that I am not able to give an overview of what these essays are doing. Now, initially you spoke about what you were trying to say about what you were attempting to do. But I'm interested in something quite strange in the essay. Because at the end of the paragraph, you say something like, you talk about the impossibility of black performance. And now, in my mind, I kind of wrote this down, like, why are you referring to these essays as doing? Normally, if one thinks of the role of the essay is something that speaks. And in typical binary logic, even in revolutionary consciousness, you find that Okapral speak about, you know, revolution is about mixing praxis with talking, you know, that kind of thing. So the role of the essay is always the one of a talking implement. And yet you are opening up a book that is very much critical of performative practice by saying that the essays themselves are doing a kind of, there's a performative dimension, a practice linked to this. So I'm interested in why you choose to say formally, to say that these essays are doing something.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this goes back to my training. And again, thinking about J.L. Austin's published Doing Things with Words.
Right.
Yeah. So there's and I mean, again, you know, the praxis and practical. Are you a armchair intellectual?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Are you sitting there in your office the whole day, or do you really know? Like, and the same goes for jazz practitioners. You know, like, are you hanging out with the young cats, or are you chilling at home, listening to old records, right? And this is where I'm losing my track. What do you think?
No, I was asking a question. Why are the essays doing something?
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm asking this in relation to the fact that there's already in the same paragraph a critique of practice. A critique of practice by way of performance. That black performance already is compromised. Right?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, you are doing.
Yeah. And I think this idea of a doing, of a performative, of a black performative. I mean, black people wake up every day and fail, right? I mean, I know people who wake up to go get paid 4,000 rand or 5,000 rand minimum wage.
Right.
But this continuously. So I mean, and in the same way that I think black music has always been going to a Kaya show with no break. And I mean, I'm being hyperbolic, right? But I'm also trying to show you the possibility that affords, right? That it is a so these essays themselves, I think they perform again this failure to articulate. I mean, it poses a critique, but I think the critique is incomplete. I think the critique fails to do what and it won't, you know what I mean? The critique can be taken and be a course seminar. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It can do all other things that I like. Afro-pessimism can be taken and you know what I mean? So, an example. Bob Marley, and again we were speaking about this earlier. Bob Marley has a song, Burning and Looting, right? So in an interview they asked him, so what do you mean about burning and looting? So instead of what the song has been mobilized to do on the street, he relates on he says, no, I was talking from the spiritual point of view. So even yourself are foreclosing the potential of such statement as burning and looting. Because of what such statement.
Well, Jengshan is also retracting his voice when he talked about KZN.
Yeah?
Well, I mean, that's not.
You know, but I mean, there's a way, and when Marley dies, what is remembered by Marley is the One Love song, because One Love gestures to a particular global transnational orientation around capital, around the intersection, right? It's that moment where he's no longer talking about the politics of the slums of Jamaica. He is gesturing towards a global consciousness that refuses to take note or rather that itself is, that himself, he corrects himself, right? He's overwritten by what is anticipated from a global icon, right? From a global figure, from a global One Love figure who's standing in for all these. So I mean, I think there's a way that this doing fails, and I think this essay, I think, these essays are gesturing towards?
No, the reason why I was asking this question, I was asking because I also feel that essays do, that writing does, and speaking does. Speaking is a form of doing. And black radical expression, whether in textual sense or in the artistic sense, whatever, is also a form of doing that is not given space, right? Because I mean, one of the things that you say in the preface, and you read it as well. You said something like, let me just go back. You say, you question the aesthetic, or rather, the question of the aesthetic is tied to the question of ontology, of being, which is also tied to the question of language. But if black people, or rather blackness, is tied to the same kind of natures, black being is considered almost like, in fact, even the phrase black being is almost like a linguistic monstrosity, oxymoron, and therefore anything that is related to that automatically comes out as null and void, without any. I remember seeing like passages from, say, the invention of Africa by Modibo, where he talks about how the relationship between denying black sentience, black humanity, and how that also translated into the denial of black culture or African culture, and how African culture expresses itself. So, in your critique of black folklore, you are arguing, if I'm correct, you correct me, that whenever people think on stage, artists are on stage, artists on the wall, think when they do something related to black expression, that particular performance does not undo the first thing. It does not give any reprieve, solace, because blackness or black people are denied the very possibility of performative power.
And
right?
I agree, and do you think that further, you also deny yourself that staying with that thing, even yourself as in the performative, you hype yourself up, right? To the, I mean, again, back to notions of psychoanalysis, David Marriott, when he speaks about what do you do with an unconscious that seems to hate you, right. And again, thinking through this notion of the unconscious, the pre-conscious, and then the conscious, the empirical world, what we see, and then the pre-conscious is what you call yourself, but the unconscious is this identification that even when you are driving down as a black person and you see three black guys walking to you in your car and you lock the door or you run away. So there's these things that are not exclusively white things. This anti-blackness is shared amongst all the people in the world, right?
When you say it's not exclusively white, what do you mean exactly?
I mean that the construction of anti-blackness itself is by mere fact waking this black life in social death, social life in social death. The ability to
make black people also participate in their own annihilation or their own through inferiority complex or whatever.
Blackness is failure, right? Right? And black people participate in this failure. That is constructed by the world.
Right.
But that is constructed by anti-blackness. The world of anti-blackness, right, is a construct of being in the world that black people themselves participate in with again, the gesturing towards flight and optimism that we have civil rights, we are post-apartheid, we are post-racial. I participate in the illusion of we opposed my violence.
But what does performance? I mean, because when you say performance black performance is impossible.
Yeah.
And you say that is based because black people are exiled
from
out of the.
Yeah. Black performance is bending the world, to end the world, right? I can't stay in that moment of an absolute revolution, like whatever revolution might be in this context, right? Of a total upheaval, right? Even my art practice itself gestures towards a recuperative moment where I can include other people. I can't only speak about my frustrations and just like how I hate the institution as a whole, not fix certain parts in the institution to accommodate me. I can't go into the institution and say, I want the institution to end. I have to go there and perform that, no, we can better, make this better, we can make that better.
You say this is what you do.
This is the performance that black people partake in, right? And I mean, this is also jazz music. Jazz music partakes in this performance of wanting to push a civil rights movement, right?
There's also like, I mean, there's a sense that you speak a lot about impossibility. And I personally, I don't know how, I kind of struggle a little bit with impossibility because I don't know how to really explain. Is it something that, for example, I actually wrote it down, where, for example, in Saidiya Hartman, you have an expression that goes like this. If pain has been largely unspoken and unrecognized, it is due to the sheer denial of black sentience rather than the inexpressibility of pain. So there's one dimension that says it is not because things are impossible, not because they are impossible by virtue of the fact that they are impossible, because they are done like that. They are impossible because they are unrelatable, that they are made impossible for black people. For example, you can have what is that place that white people stay only by themselves? Orion. But you will never be able to have a blacks only organization. I mean, practically, the Black Resident First is unable to register as a blacks only organization in the country. But you have Orion. So I'm thinking about when you say impossible, which vista or line are you taking?
I mean, we've also been speaking about it that the BNF is going to fail. and we know this, but we need to, I mean, you know, like we know this. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like,
but why would the BNF fail and not the EFF? Because they're all performing.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the rhetoric of the BNF is completely different to the rhetoric of the EFF. And I mean, again, we are speaking positional ontology. We're speaking things that make people anxious.
Right.
We're speaking to people's unconscious. I'm not speaking to your conscious mind. I'm speaking to things that make you anxious. Right. Like when you see a group of black men. That's what right. BNF speaks to that moment when you see a group of black people just holding. Right? So I mean,
and does this translate musically, artistically? Can an audience come into an exhibition and have the same reaction that they get from?
No, there's no way. And this is precisely the failure that sometimes Coltrane, he writes Alabama. Right. Monstrosity in Alabama. But what you get from Coltrane becomes the same. They make
The
you,
world embraces.
yeah, they make that moment about how consciously aware you are. It becomes a moment of anti-establishment as opposed to a moment of accounting for, for Black Death,
Right.
that requires like a response, like, you know what I mean, at the level of flesh, but then what happens in that moment is that you get recuperated into the sainthood. It's just like, sensei, so say, you know what I mean? It's all this, it's all like a plea to these forces that will incorporate the song and be like, this is great art.
Do we have an example of Black performances in the history that have went there, that have gone there? I mean, now you've painted an image of young Black men. I see them in the corner. I immediately switch off, close my heart. Because I'm trying to think historically. Of course, you do have a figure such as Fanon, or someone who, when seen as like a Black Armageddon or something like Mau Mau or Porco in Palm. But I'm trying to figure out, is there a kind of Black performative practice that we can think of? I mean, we can all join in. We can all join in now. I've got 200 and something questions here. Nevertheless, if anyone has, because to me has painted a very grim picture, and the truth of that picture is what South Africa still cannot stand. That all of us are bonding, what's the David expression? Bonding with negrophobia. All of us hate, we all share a hatred of Black. We don't know how to explain, we don't know how to, but we want so much from Black. We want the blood of Black. We want the entertainment of Black. But we also don't want Black. And I'm wondering if there was a moment in Black arts. Because really from my perspective of the Black aesthetic, because that's another thing I wanted to, a technical question around the distinction between, what do you call it? Inesthetics, anti-aesthetics. These are all technical terms in philosophical and theory of art. And also de-aesthetics, but then there's Black aesthetics. And my form of Black aesthetics is not the form of people playing an instrument, because white people can do that. Everybody else who's not Black can do that, and even do it better than that. Yeah. And the theory of the Black aesthetic that I have identified with, which is Julian Mayfield's notion that the desire for an upheaval, right, to burn shit down. And I'm not saying this for sensational sense, but because that's the only thing. We share everything with white people, with Indians and whatever. But what we do not share is this bonding over the hatred. Black people are the only people who live with that possibility. And I don't know whether art is able to grapple with that. Of course, there's representatives,
Yeah. I think
yeah. Thanks for such an engaging talk. So I read through the preface and so on. Some statements I just look at and think this is blasphemy. Wow.
By the way, the book is 230.
No, it's worth the read. Goodness me. Okay, let's take it back to art. Right? Because I think definitely my interest is around the postulations you're making around art and the incapacity of art, right, to engage with Blackness and its ontology. Do you think that outside of Blackness now, let's just talk about art and performance, isn't able to grasp any ontology.
I'm not interested in that. I'm really not. But I hear you.
Yeah. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Then that will maybe assist me to understand why you say what you are saying. So can art hold any experience?
Lacan says subjectivity comes by way of alienation. That when you go to the mirror as the infant of God, you see yourself, you realize that you are not the big A, the object of all the sees. There is an actual being outside. So the only way to make sense of things is to create tools and languages that can facilitate for the moment of alienation, right? So that's what they say about art, right? That art is a moment of alienation. And psychology says sublimation, right? That art can take pain, can take trauma, and sublimate it so that it doesn't live in your conscious mind, and sublimate it into something productive, something healing, something that you can get something out of art. So what I'm trying to say is that with black art, like, if it's inside and you put it out, it hurts you too. David Bowie says all the shit that you read. People are just like, oh, this is hurtful shit, this is blasphemy. It's just like, but think about the actual experience of someone having to live through all that, right? Let alone what, so I mean, I know I'm going away, but I hope I'm not answering your question, but I hope I'm getting to some kind of conceptual framework that can help you sort of like get to that.
Yeah, but I mean, tell me something. If we say, well, whether arts can hold any kind of ontology, if we have to speak conceptually about the very term art, it's very specific to a geopolitical place, has particular conditions that then differentiates itself between itself and something that is art, something that is non-art, something that is artifact, something that is inferior to itself. It provides a certain kind of ontology of art based on the experience of what it means to be pure artistic form. And I think
pure
and this is very particular to a time in Europe, to modernism, to enslavement. So the ontology of art cannot act as if it is something in the air that doesn't have. It might have these things that it does to say it's universal, but where does it trace that formulation from?
So just to piggyback on what you're saying, I mean, in Kant's essay, what is enlightenment?
Right.
He says enlightenment is precondition on freedom. So and if artistic practice are practices of the enlightenment, they are precondition on freedom. So how do unfree people participate in tools for free beings in the world, right? So I mean, there's this thing that if one has to have the precondition of freedom to be able to participate in participate. Participate. Always just like pride. After all of this, you still say participate. That's what it is. Yeah. To participate in, it fails even at that moment of it's enunciatory sort of like claims,
There's a book by Kant on beauty. What the name of the title is? Let me put it. Which I think comes after or before, right? Before Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, where Kant developed the concept of beauty into some kind of schematic hierarchical structure. He places the figure of the white woman as the emblematic figure of beauty. That beauty is the beauty that has a history in Western artistic tradition of all kinds.
Yeah.
But guess what is at the bottom of that thing? There's a black woman. So I'm just saying the question of art and ontology, I mean, it's a question that artists try to run away from for the longest time. But in a text by Tony Negri, think it's called Art in the Multitude. And then there's a part where he talks about art and not abstraction, but art and ontology. Where the ontology of art for him is basically about sitting with this problem. You know, sitting with the problems of enlightenment. And having to work through those problems. Not to change them, to redirect them somehow.
Recuperate.
To make art, what do you call it? In South Africa, we have a term called transitional art. That's basically what white people try to do to accommodate black forms of artistic practice. Or call black people's art by particular names or township art. These are all accommodating forms of art sticking with this kind of ontological premise. You know what I'm saying?